आज हमारा टॉपिक जो है वो बर्रे सगीर के मुसलमानों की पॉलिटिकल स्ट्रगल का है कि किस तरीके से बर्रे सगीर के मुसलमानों ने सियासी जदोजहद का आगाज़ किया। और टॉपिक इज डिक्टेटरशिप। द डेफिनेशन ऑफ डिक्टेटरशिप, द टाइप्स ऑफ डिक्टेटरशिप are its characteristics and facts. Dictatorship is the political system of the government. It is a unitary form of government characterized by a single leader, a group of leaders, and little or no toleration for political pluralism or independent programs or media. It is a form of government in which one person or a small group possesses absolute power without effective constitutional limitations. The term dictatorship comes from the Latin title dictator, which in the Roman Republic designated a temporary magistrate who was granted extraordinary powers in order to deal with state crises. Modern dictators, however, resemble ancient tyrants rather than ancient dictators. Ancient philosophers' description of the tyrannies of Greece and Sicily go toward characterizing modern dictatorships. Dictators usually resort to force or fraud to gain despotic political power, which they maintain through the use of intimidation, terror, and the suppression of basic civil liberties. And they may also employ techniques of mass propaganda in order to sustain their public support. With the decline and disappearance in the 19th and 20th centuries of monarchies based on hereditary descent, dictatorship became one of the two chief forms of government in use by nations throughout the world. The other being constitutional democracy. Rule by dictators has taken several different forms. Latin America in the 19th century, various dictators arose after effective central authority had collapsed and the new nations recently freed from Spanish colonial rule. These caudillos are self-proclaimed leaders, usually led a private army, and try to establish control over a territory before marching upon a weak national government. Antonio López de Santa Anna in Mexico and Juan Manuel de Rosas in Argentina are examples of such leaders. Later 20th century dictators in Latin America were different. They were national rather than provincial leaders and often were put in their position of power by nationalistic military officers. They usually allied themselves with a particular social class and attempted either to maintain the interests of wealthy and privileged elites or to institute far-reaching left-wing social reforms. In the new states of Africa and Asia after World War II, dictators quickly established themselves on the ruins of constitutional arrangements inherited from the Western colonial power that had proved unworkable in the absence of a strong middle class and in the face of local traditions of autocratic rule. In some such countries, elected presidents and prime ministers captured personal power by establishing one-party rule and suppressing the opposition, while in others, the army seized power and established military dictatorship. The communist and fascist dictatorships that arose in various technologically advanced countries in the first half of the 20th century were distinctively different from the authoritarian regimes of Latin America or the post-colonial dictatorships of Africa and Asia. Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler and the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin were the leading example of such modern totalitarian dictatorships. The crucial elements of both were the identification of the state with a single mass party and of the party with its charismatic leader, the use of an official ideology to legitimize and maintain the regime, the use of terror and propaganda to suppress dissent and stifle opposition. So the use of an official ideology to legitimize and maintain the regime, the use of terror and propaganda to suppress dissent and stifle opposition, and the use of modern science and technology to control the economy and individual behavior. Soviet-type communist dictatorships arose in Central and Eastern Europe. China and other countries in the wake of World War II, though most of them, as well as the Soviet Union itself, had collapsed by the last decade of the 20th century. During the times of domestic or foreign crisis, even most constitutional governments have conferred emergency powers on the chief executive, and in some notable cases, this provided the opportunity for duly elected leaders to overthrow democracy and rule dictatorially thereafter. The proclamation of emergency rule, for example, was the beginning of the dictatorships of Hitler in Germany, Benito Mussolini in Italy, Kemal Atatürk in Turkey, and Joseph Pilsudski in Poland, and Antonio de Oliveira Salazar in Portugal. In other democracies, however, constitutional arrangements have survived quite lengthy periods of crisis, as in Great Britain and the United States during World War II, in which the use of extraordinary power by the executive came to a halt with the end of the wartime emergency. The royal rule, as legitimized by blood, dissent, and almost vanished as an effective principle of government in the modern world. Monocracy, a term that comprehends the rule of the non-Western royal absolutists, of generals and strongmen in Latin America and Asia, of a number of leaders in post-colonial Africa, and of the totalitarian heads of communist states, still flourished. Indeed, the 20th century, which witnessed the careers of Atatürk, Benito Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Francisco Franco, Mao Zedong, Juan Perón, Tito, and Jamal Abdel Nasser, Sukarno, Kwame Nkrumah, and Charles de Gaulle, could appear in history as the age of plebiscitary dictatorship. In many of the states of Africa and Asia, for example, dictators quickly established themselves on the ruins of constitutional arrangements inherited from the Western colonial power. In some of these countries, presidents and prime ministers captured personal power by banning opposition parties and building replicas of the one-party systems of the communist world. In other new countries, the armies seized power and military dictatorships were established, whether as presidential dictatorships or as military dictatorships. The regimes that came into being appear to have had common roots in the social and economic problems of the new state. The constitutional systems inherited from the colonial powers proved unworkable in the absence of strong middle class. Local traditions of autocratic rule retained a powerful influence. The army, one of the few organized forces in society, was also often the only force capable of maintaining order, and a tiny intellectual class was important for economic progress. Frustrated by the lack of opportunity and deeply influenced by the example of authoritarianism in other countries,